Throughout history, the true character of leaders has often been revealed in their response to failure, and no one captures this more sharply than Robert Greene, who once said that a leader's reaction to adversity exposes the essence of their nature. But when it comes to narcissistic leaders, this truth becomes even more evident. These leaders are often defined by their intense need for validation and their fiery rage in response to criticism. Their egos are fragile, and their thirst for revenge can cloud their judgment, blinding them to the reality around them. This is the topic I want to explore today: the dangers of narcissistic leadership, something the Stoics knew all too well. The Stoics, especially those who held power, understood the weight of leadership. Marcus Aurelius, for example, often warned against the perils of vanity and self-delusion. But not every leader heeded such counsel. One tragic example is Nero, who was adopted by the Roman emperor and groomed to take his place. From an early age, Nero was surrounded by luxury and privilege, but also had access to some of the best philosophers of the time. His teacher, Seneca, even introduced him to Stoic philosophy. But despite these powerful influences, Nero's reign became a stark contrast to that of Marcus Aurelius. Nero's downfall wasn't simply a matter of poor decision-making. It was a case of a leader who became consumed by his own ego. Nero was addicted to adoration. He surrounded himself with people who flattered him, telling him he was the greatest poet, the most talented charioteer, and a beloved ruler. He rigged chariot races just to claim victory, and he exiled anyone who surpassed him in talent. His craving for attention was insatiable, so much so that it warped his ability to see the truth. He lived in a bubble, surrounded by sycophants who fed his delusions. And tragically, it was this very vanity that made him vulnerable to manipulation and dishonesty. Nero's story is a powerful reminder of the dangers of narcissism in leadership. His vanity led him to create a distorted world where everyone around him was forced to affirm his greatness. In fact, he even arranged for slaves to cheer for him during chariot races to give the illusion of popularity. It didn't matter that these gestures were hollow. Nero's fragile ego needed constant reassurance. His behavior escalated as he grew more paranoid. After murdering his wife, he even found a male slave who resembled her, dressing him up to pretend he was still married to her. This is what we call the dictator's trap. When a leader's ego is fragile, and when they surround themselves with people too afraid to speak the truth, they lose touch with reality. Instead of confronting their failures, they lie to themselves. Nero, for example, continued to think of himself as a great ruler, despite the fact that his empire was crumbling. When faced with crises such as the Great Fire of Rome, instead of rising to the occasion and uniting the people, he used the tragedy as an excuse for his own grandiose building projects and scapegoated the Christians. Seneca, a wise Stoic, repeatedly warned Nero about his delusions and narcissism. He tried to steer him away from this path, but to no avail. Nero became more isolated and dismissive of his advisors, cutting himself off from the wisdom that might have saved him. Power did not corrupt him. It revealed who he truly was, a fragile, paranoid man who lacked the fortitude to face difficult truths. The truth is that narcissistic leaders are often deeply insecure. Beneath their facade of confidence lies a constant fear of being exposed as inadequate. This is what makes them so dangerous. Their need to eliminate threats, even imagined ones, leads them to make irrational decisions, as we saw with Nero's brutal purges. But this type of leadership is unsustainable. Eventually, the weight of lies, deceit, and delusion becomes too much to bear. Greene's insight about a leader's response in a crisis is crucial. When a narcissistic leader faces adversity, their true character is revealed. For Nero, that character was one of fragility and fear. In the end, his leadership was defined not by strength or wisdom, but by insecurity and delusion. His reign spiraled into chaos and cruelty, leaving a wake of destruction in its path. This is why it is so essential for leaders to remain grounded in truth, humility, and self-awareness. The Stoics knew this well. Leaders must be willing to confront uncomfortable truths and make tough decisions, not simply surround themselves with people who tell them what they want to hear. True leadership requires a balance of power, responsibility, and a willingness to grow. Narcissistic leaders like Nero may start with potential, but if they don't check their egos, they are doomed to spiral into ruin. Nero's reign is a stark example of what happens when a leader's ego outweighs their capability. Stoic philosophers like Thales and Helvidius stood as a powerful resistance against Nero, refusing to submit to his delusional grasp on power. Nero's inability to tolerate opposition was his fatal flaw. He couldn't stand anyone questioning his actions, especially not the Stoics, who held firmly to truth and justice. This constant clash between the emperor's tyranny and the Stoics' moral integrity created a cycle of conflict, one where Nero's paranoia and insecurity led him to eliminate anyone who didn't flatter or comply with him. One of the Stoics, Agrippinus, even earned Nero's ire simply by not attending the emperor's lavish parties, rejecting the notion that he was entitled to universal adoration. This refusal to be part of Nero's self-constructed reality was a challenge to his fragile ego, a move that Nero simply couldn't accept. Similarly, Helvidius was banished after expressing admiration for Brutus, the man who killed Caesar, because Nero saw this as a threat to his absolute rule. Nero's paranoia reached its peak when he decided Thales had to be silenced. He was a man who insisted on honesty and virtue, making him the perfect enemy for a ruler who thrived on deception and corruption. Thales' refusal to bow to Nero's power only intensified their conflict. When accused of false charges, he didn't beg for mercy or submit. Instead, he faced his accusers with dignity, demanding they name their charges openly. Even as Nero sentenced him to death, Thales remained unyielding, declaring, "Nero can kill me, but he cannot harm me," signifying his belief that virtue and integrity were beyond the reach of tyranny. Ultimately, Nero's cruelty and incompetence were his undoing. As he became increasingly isolated, even from those close to him, his rule descended into chaos. In a particularly chilling moment, Nero ordered the execution of Seneca, the man who had raised him like a son. But Seneca, knowing what was coming, wasn't surprised. He understood that Nero's character was always destined to lead to violence and betrayal. The signs had been there all along. Nero's downfall was inevitable. His inability to take responsibility, his vanity, and his narcissism created a vicious cycle that spiraled into madness. When the end came, Nero couldn't face it like a man. He was too weak to end his own life and had to rely on others to do the job. His final words, "This is loyalty," are a tragic reflection of his distorted worldview, where loyalty meant unquestioning support of his selfish desires. He never understood what it meant to be virtuous or to lead with integrity. This story is not just ancient history, it's a timeless cautionary tale. Leaders like Nero, driven by self-interest and narcissism, ultimately destroy themselves. But the Stoics remind us that character is fate. Nero's fall was a direct result of his bad character, his inability to lead with wisdom, humility, or truth. Fast forward to modern times, and the echoes of Nero's leadership style can be seen in figures like Donald Trump, whose behavior as president mirrored many of Nero's flaws. Like Nero, Trump rejected the advice of experts and preferred to surround himself with those who flattered his ego rather than challenged him. He had a penchant for disregarding inconvenient facts, just as Nero dismissed the truths presented by those around him. Trump's disdain for complexity and truth led to disastrous decisions, much like Nero's refusal to face the reality of his regime's corruption. Both men were more concerned with creating a false reality that suited their desires than with addressing the real issues at hand. The Stoics teach us that when a leader's priorities are misplaced, when they focus more on their image and power than on the well-being of their people, chaos is inevitable. Nero, like Trump, was a leader who destabilized everything he touched, from his relationships to his empire, all because he couldn't accept the truth about himself or the world around him. The Stoic lessons here are clear. A good leader must embrace reality, act with integrity, and cultivate virtues like humility and wisdom, or they will inevitably fail. Narcissism is a dangerous force, especially in leadership. When a leader's primary concern is their own self-image, they cannot effectively serve the people they're meant to guide. A narcissist's life revolves around themselves, unable to see beyond their own reflection. Take, for instance, the example of Donald Trump. Here is a leader who loves to use the public stage to tear down enemies, fire back at every critique, and even turn holidays like Thanksgiving into platforms for personal attacks. His self-proclaimed greatness, comparing himself to Abraham Lincoln, reveals an almost unimaginable level of vanity and delusion. What stands out is not just his arrogance, but also his inability to accept responsibility. During the height of the pandemic, Trump declared that he didn't take responsibility for anything. That's an egregious failure of leadership because, as Harry Truman famously said, the buck stops here. A true leader understands that owning responsibility, especially in times of crisis, is crucial. Narcissistic leaders, however, can't do that. Admitting fault would require them to face the reality of their own shortcomings, something they simply cannot bear. It's this refusal to recognize their mistakes that prevents them from growing or learning, which makes them inherently dangerous. Those who might be able to help steer such a leader in a better direction, like General Mattis, McMaster, or others, are often pushed aside. Why? Because narcissistic leaders need validation, not guidance. They surround themselves with yes men who only echo their beliefs, fueling their delusion, and leaving no room for constructive criticism. This dynamic ultimately leads them down a dangerous path, surrounding themselves with people who only enable their worst impulses. When Trump removed General John Kelly, his chief of staff, Kelly warned him that he would eventually face impeachment. And so it came to pass. Trump's disastrous handling of both the pandemic and his refusal to accept the outcome of the 2020 election was rooted in narcissism. His inability to accept defeat mirrors the tragic tale of the Roman populist Catiline. Catiline's inability to accept his loss to Cicero led him to incite a mob to overturn the election results, much like what we saw on January 6th. The mob, whipped up by lies, violence, and hatred, stormed the Capitol, committing atrocities in the name of their delusional leader. This moment in history is especially jarring when we contrast it with George Washington's actions during a similar crisis. When disgruntled soldiers in the Continental Army threatened to overthrow the government due to unpaid wages, Washington intervened, addressing the mob's grievances with wisdom and authority. On January 6th, Trump's response was the complete opposite. He enabled the violence by doing nothing, refusing to take responsibility, and even mocking those who pleaded for him to intervene. This behavior is a hallmark of narcissism, as seen in the despotic actions of figures like Nero, who, during the Great Fire of Rome, turned a blind eye to the suffering of his people. The Stoics, such as Seneca, understood the dangers of narcissism and populism. They recognized that when leaders incite violence and mob mentality, the consequences can be disastrous. The fall of the Roman Republic was not a single event, but a series of escalating acts of violence, fueled by leaders who pandered to the mob. The Stoics warned that such leaders cannot be trusted with power. Trump's behavior serves as a stark reminder of why we must demand virtue and wisdom from our leaders. Leaders who are driven by ego, vanity, and resentment do not serve the people. They only serve themselves. The Stoics taught us that true leadership is about serving others with courage, justice, and wisdom. This is the type of leadership we must aspire to, not the self-centered, destructive kind that threatens our institutions and freedoms. In the words of Lincoln, we cannot tolerate the mobocratic spirit, that destructive force that seeks to tear down everything in its path. As citizens, we must stand firm against leaders who foster such chaos. We must hold our leaders accountable and demand that they embody the virtues of self-discipline, courage, and wisdom. Ultimately, the Stoic ideal is clear. We need leaders who are committed to virtue and who serve the people, not their own egos. Narcissistic leaders like Trump may lead us to dark places, but through virtue, we can chart a better course.